Hello, everyone. My name is Taylin Washington Harmon, and I'm the clinical trials editor here at blackdoctor.org. And I'm really excited to bring on the very special guest that we have today because, as you know, February is Heart Health Month, and hypertension, high blood pressure, heart disease are among the top killers of Black Americans. So it is now more than ever just super important that we take part in the clinical research that can help save our lives. So I want to bring on Dr. Jane Morgan. She is a cardiologist and the vice president of medical affairs at Hello Heart, which is a digital health platform to encourage heart health. Thank you for coming on the show, Dr. Jane Morgan.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Taylor. It's a pleasure.
Yes. So tell us a little bit more about what you do and how you got into the field of cardiology.
So, as a cardiologist, it's first of all, it's very rare to be a female cardiologist, even rarer to be a Black female cardiologist. I think we still make up only about 0.1% of all physicians. So, I think it's very important during Black History Month to also recognize that a lot of what we do day in and day out, and we don't think about it, is actually Black history. So it's not common to see that, and it's a very, arduous road. So I really won't sugarcoat it. But as a cardiologist, I've spent a great part of my career in clinical practice, but also in research at Solvay Pharmaceuticals, at AbbVie, and also advising companies like Moderna and Pfizer and Novartis. And then quite a bit of time at Piedmont Healthcare, leading their cardiovascular research program, and then education, and then doing a lot of media education as well. And then at this part of my career, I am sort of back in the biotech arena. I'm the vice president of medical affairs for Hello Heart. Not only are we a digital heart health company, we focus on remote blood pressure monitoring, making certain that people understand the importance of maintaining good blood pressure control to make certain you have good pregnancy outcomes, but also good heart outcomes as well. And that's incredibly important for Black women. We have the highest rate of maternal mortality, and heart disease is still the number one killer.
Right, that totally makes sense. I actually lost a family member in a postpartum incident regarding her heart. So
Oh
that's
my goodness.
an issue that's really close to me, close to my heart in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
And before I, get into the interview, I just want to remind all the people watching that, we have the comment section open. If you have any questions for me and Dr. Morgan, please feel free to drop your comments in the chat. So I guess let's start here. Like,
Mhm.
what are some of the primary barriers that you think are keeping Black people, or particularly Black women, from heart health clinical trials?
So there are a number of things. When we look at something called weathering, which I like to sometimes talk about, weathering, like the weather, Weather. And it's sort of, you liken it to sort of the side of a house, a wooden house. And as the seasons go by, the wood just wears down and wears down and wears down. It gets beaten by storms. That's weathering. And that's something that is often used to describe Black women. I certainly often use it to describe Black women. And really what it denotes is the constancy of high effort coping in a society that is both gender conscious and race conscious. And then we are both. And the effort that it takes to continually navigate that society almost 100% of the time, with the exception really of being within our own homes. How are we interacting with our neighbors? How are we interacting with people at the store? Can we be our true selves? At the job, are we always in positions where we're trying to make others feel comfortable about our presence, and we are never able to feel comfortable there? What is it like raising Black boys and getting their driver's license and helping them try to navigate a society where often they are also targets? That's weathering, the constancy of high effort coping. And what we've seen in weathering is telomeres. So these are the end caps of your DNA. And the length of those telomeres really denotes your age. It's sort of like rings on a tree. And the longer they are, generally the younger you are. And it turns out when we look at Black women's telomeres in comparison to white women's telomeres, ours shorten much earlier. And what that really denotes is advanced aging at about 10 years earlier than white women. And so, we often like to say, oh, Black don't crack because we look good on the outside. Our melanin
I
protects
say
our
that.
skin. But on the inside, there's a completely different story where our biologic age is actually more advanced than our chronologic age. Or a different way to say that is the age of our bodies is actually older than the date on our birth certificate by about 10 years. And that really then impacts wellness because what happens? Screenings happen at a certain age. But if your body is more biologically advanced, maybe you should have gotten that screening earlier. We have the higher risk of cancer, higher rates of heart disease, higher rates of inflammatory diseases, any number of things. So these are all situations that and areas that I often talk about because it also translates over into menopause. Black women enter menopause about a year or so earlier than white women. And why is that important? That's because menopause is also a time of increased heart risk. So you don't necessarily want to enter it earlier because the earlier you enter into menopause, the sooner your risk of heart disease also continues to elevate.
That's all very real. So that's definitely, putting Black women at risk. So how is this kind of keeping us from getting the care that we need, and in particular leading us to not being in clinical trials?
Yeah. And so, when we look at care, oftentimes it is a multifactorial, right? So it's about access, it's about trust in a system that is not really built for us. It is about trust in a system that's not often very welcoming. At its best, the system is a behemoth that is hard to navigate, even for the hardiest. And I would consider myself to be one of the hardiest because I straddle both lines, right? I am a physician, I'm a part of the system, but I'm also a Black female on this other side of the system. It's still incredibly, incredibly hard to navigate a system that is not built to keep us well. It's really a system that's built to treat diseases, but not to prevent illnesses and prevent the disease process. So what happens? You generally see your doctor when you're sick. You generally get screenings at certain ages. So the system is not built to keep us well. We are there to intervene, and we're very good at intervention, but prevention obviously is worth a pound of cure. When we look at clinical trials, so how do we really get here? Clinical trials are really the cornerstone of how we get our drugs, our investigational compounds, our devices, how they go before the FDA and get approved. And by and large, Black people don't really participate in clinical trials. Another word for clinical trials is research. We don't really participate in research for all of our historical context. All of the atrocities that have been committed against us in the name of research. Most of a good part of obstetrics and gynecologic advancements have been done with the involuntary servitude of Black women having multiple experimental surgeries at the hands of a doctor named James Marion Sims. And he successfully created a procedure, but sacrificed Black women in order to have this contribution to medical society. And that part is often lost. And he's been called the father of gynecology for creating, these surgical procedures that white women benefited from with anesthesia. I would also add. But it was Black women who had no choice, often slaves, who were indentured people that he operated on against their will and without anesthesia, and multiple times, especially on 3 women. And so, I can't blame us for not wanting to be involved in research. Research in the United States has not been our friend. And even when we have been involuntarily sacrificed, like Henrietta Lacks, and have not received financial compensation, again, like Henrietta Lacks and her family, we still, have been excluded from the system. We have not been thanked. Right? No one has even acknowledged our contribution. We are excluded from all of the medical textbooks, but quite a bit of this data and information has been gathered because of our involuntary participation, but also because we did not have rights and things were taken from us, including body parts and cells and those types of things. So when people say, we don't really participate in research, I want to be clear. I get it. I completely get it. But I want us to begin to move our thoughts away from exploitation and more towards representation, and to begin to think about what that means within clinical trials. Because what happens is that these drugs and devices are developed on and for a very narrow slice of the population. So basically, white men are the ones who are enrolled in these trials. And so the only thing we really know when the FDA approves the data is whether it works or not on white men. It certainly, the United States distributes our drugs and devices all over the world. But we only really know when we drill down to it that it works on white men. And when we look at the demographic of white men, they only comprise 9% of the global population. But
9%?
almost 9%.
Even I wasn't aware of that statistic.
9%. And globally, there's another 91% of us who'll be using those medications, and even more than that when we talk about just women, because again, white women by and large aren't in the trials as well. And so you can see how this starts to become a problem. And we're not necessarily talking about genetics race as a biologic factor. What we're talking about is how we live, how we eat, products we use, how we interact with the environment. All of those things are different and they come to play. Again, how is weathering impacting our body? How is that going to impact how we interact with these drugs? Are we going to have side effects? What are our customs? Those are the kinds of things that have to be captured within clinical trials, such that when you have side effects, and we call them adverse events within clinical trials, that they are occurring within a very controlled, contained environment with lots of oversight of physicians, and you can have immediate access to care. What happens now is we're not included in the trials. They get approved. The data really is just approved on white men, but it's going to be prescribed to you when you go to your doctor. And then what happens? You're out on the soccer field or you're out at Disney World when you start having side effects. You're not in this close, contained, carefully watched environment of the clinical trial. You're just out on your own. And the side effect may not have been one that showed up during the trial because what? People like you weren't enrolled in the trials. So when you contact your doctor is not even aware that it has anything to do with the medication because it's not one of the listed side effects. So you can see how we continue, by not being included in clinical trials, we continue to allow ourselves to be experimented upon.
Exactly. So how can healthcare professionals and people who work in the medical industry like you, how can they improve this issue of representation for Black folks in clinical trials, especially in such, a heavy space as heart health?
The number one reason that all people of any race, of any gender, of any creed in this country participate in clinical trials, the number one reason is that a trusted physician approached you about it. So keep that in mind when I tell you that 80% or just slightly more of all African Americans are seen by African American physicians by choice. Why is that? We first seek to go somewhere where we will feel safe, where we don't think that we will be harmed. Secondly, we go somewhere where we seek to be understood, where there's some things that are unspoken that are understood, where there are conversations that can happen without words, which you understand what the person needs. That's called cultural congruence. And so, if the number one reason that a person enters a clinical trial is that you're approached by a trusted physician, most principal investigators, these are the doctors who are leading the clinical trials, are white men, more than 92%. And the number one reason to enter a clinical trial is that you're approached by a trusted physician. And most Black people are seen by Black physicians who are not principal investigators. You can see how very easily we're not going to be included. And people also are not going to think about it either. And if you're part of that 15 or 20% that are seen by white physicians, if you're approached by that white physician, even though that is your doctor and you see that doctor, most Black people, when I talk to them, still have reticence of being included in a clinical trial when their white doctor approaches them. So we have to begin to really peel back the onion. It's so multi-layered. So what do companies have to do? These big drug, pharma, device companies have to begin to recruit Black physicians and train them as principal investigators, such that Black physicians have an understanding of the clinical trials, have oversight and responsibility, and then can be that trusted voice to approach their patients to try to move their patients towards better care. And here's something else about clinical trials that you may not know. I would argue that most patients in this country are treated to the top level of evidence-based medicine, the top level of FDA-approved drugs. But what white men get is that level of care that's behind the curtain. It's not the top level. They get platinum level because what they get access to are tomorrow's drugs today. That's what they get access to. And I'll give you an example. When Donald Trump was president the first time and we had a COVID pandemic that was raging under him, and he was largely not in support of vaccines. When he came down with COVID in the White House, you may or may not remember this, physicians were watching very carefully. He was rapidly deteriorating. And he was airlifted to Walter Reed Hospital. O2 sats were low. It means his oxygen levels in his body were low, overweight, elderly, not looking good for him. These are the early variants, the beta, the delta, where the mortality was high. What happened? And that might have skipped and it might have, not come to your attention, but certainly as a physician, as a researcher, it was very evident to me. He was immediately given, upon arrival at Walter Reed Hospital, the anticlonal antibodies.
Monoclonal antibodies.
Monoclonal antibodies. Thank you. He was given monoclonal antibodies. Now, that wasn't even a thing then, right? There were no monoclonal antibodies for COVID. So what is this slurry that he's being given that is already there, prepped and available to him that no other American is getting? That
Experimental medicine
antibody,
yes,
was given to him under emergency authorization that he received because he was the president.
Yes.
From a clinical trial that was going on in the United States.
Right.
He got access to a clinical trial that was credited with saving his life. He was on the downward trajectory towards death. The monoclonal antibody that he received immediately, that they procured for him because he was given an exception as an emergency authorization as the president of the United States. He got access to something that nobody else in the entire world had access to except for the people in those clinical trials. That's the value of a clinical trial. And, regardless of whether someone preaches anti-science and whether they're not for anti-science, watch what they do.
Mhm.
People are always against science until they need it.
Exactly.
And then they will absolutely, so many people refused the COVID vaccine, but when they were sick, they came straight to the hospital, straight to the emergency room. Even though they claimed to be anti-science, they would show up at an entire edifice and institution that was built for science to be cured. So be careful what people say and what they try to lead you to do. Watch what they actually do when their backs are to the wall and what happens. That is clinical trials is the medicine behind the screen. That's top
Mhm.
level platinum care. Donald Trump is a great example of that. He received monoclonal antibody therapies when it wasn't even a thing. It was in the midst of clinical trials, and he received it. And it was credited with saving his life.
That's very real. Thank you
That-
for that example. That's a very strong example.
That's right.
So back to heart health. What are some heart conditions that you feel like Black folks are disproportionately affected by and should be prioritized in clinical
Right.
trial research?
So we are disproportionately impacted by what we call atherosclerosis or atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, a big, big long term that just means plaques and blockages in our arteries. And those arteries that are feeding blood to the heart, that blood is carrying oxygen. That's what the heart needs to work, right? The heart is a muscle, same muscle that is made up of your arms and your legs. The heart is actually a pump. It is a muscle. And so what happens to us? We have an accelerated process often of this atherosclerosis, of developing these plaques in our arteries. Now, what is the risk factor? What are the risk factors for developing plaques? Elevated blood pressure that is not being checked, is not being treated, or you're not taking medications, or you don't have access to pharmacies, or you can't pay for it, or you don't trust your doctor, whatever the reason. We've got high blood pressure, obesity, which is also a driver of high blood pressure. The heavier you are, the more likely you are to have high blood pressure. What else? Obesity drives what? Higher cholesterol levels, cholesterol, lipids, fats. That's a risk factor for heart disease. That's what those plaques are made of. Those are made of fat deposits and calcium. And just the overall inflammatory process of chronic obesity creates an inflammatory process in the body. Inflammation also increases the development of these atherosclerotic plaques. Lack of exercise, lack of movement. All of those things are risk factors. Here's something else that I will tell you and just give you a couple of little pearls. Two things that are simple and that help you have a long and healthy heart life. One, get your flu shots. Why do I say that? People who have heart disease, and you may have heart disease and may not know it, but if you're overweight, you might have diabetes, you might have high blood pressure, you might have cholesterol, you've got all these risk factors, you are at risk. If you were to get the flu, your risk of having a heart attack goes up by 6 times if you get the flu, if you have heart disease. So get your flu shots. There's no reason to risk that. The second thing is get regular dental checkups. Poor dental hygiene can cause an infection in the valves of your heart and make you very, very sick. You might actually even need surgery to repair those valves. So two very simple talk about preventive care. I'm talking now just about preventive care, simple things that people don't talk to you about that's actually related to your heart. Get a flu shot, get your dental checkups. That's
No,
heart health.
you said
That's
those are
heart
two
health.
so simple things, and those are definitely not discussed nearly enough. I
That's
mean,
right.
I hear so much about heart health and heart care, but never about the external factors aside from, oh, you need to lose weight, oh, you need to exercise more. But no, those are some really
Right.
great
Just
tips
really
there.
good tips. Just do those two things. And obviously, you know the others. I'm not here to preach it. You want to exercise. keep your weight down. You want to keep your blood pressure down. But I'm talking about just two other things that you can do as part of your just regular maintenance that sound as if they're completely unrelated to the heart, going to the dentist and getting a flu shot. But now I'm connecting those dots for you so that you, and hopefully, because our flu vaccination uptake this year was low, is at about 45%. And we are moving through the deadliest flu season that we have had now in the last 15 years. And a lot of those deaths will be cardiac deaths. So get your flu shots.
So you touched upon a little bit earlier that, pharma companies and medical device companies really need to rely a little bit more on Black physicians to talk to their patients about clinical trials.
To include them and train them. They've been excluded.
Yes. So what are some other ways that can, increase the necessary representation of Black Americans in clinical trials, especially for heart health? What are some things that can be done aside from, Black physicians becoming principal investigators?
Right. And the other thing is just, people who are listening to this podcast to know that you can advocate for yourself. And guess what? You can ask your doctor about it, especially if you have a chronic medical condition and or if you have something that's rare. Ask your physician, she or he, if there are clinical trials available. If he or she is not aware of them, ask them if they will look them up for you, and then make sure you follow up. So you can actually be proactive and ask about it. You can also, if you have a university center near you, go on their website and just look through the clinical trials. Oftentimes, they'll have a fairly extensive research and clinical trial program there. And oftentimes they do community outreach, but it may not be getting to you. So you may have to be proactive about it. Again, if you've got a chronic condition, because there are lots of trials always done on chronic conditions. So, anything lupus and diabetes and autoimmune diseases and these types of things. And you're something that you're living with every day and you're managing it, including chronic pain or those kinds of things. But then if you also have just something that's rare, not that many people have it. Oftentimes there are clinical trials also being done on these very rare, what we call orphan indications. So don't count yourself out. And when you think there is no other therapy, remember there's that whole curtain. I want you to look behind the curtain because there's another area of therapy available. It just traditionally has not been available to us. So remember, when you get to the end of the line, you're not there yet. Look behind the curtain for clinical trials.
Yes, I definitely want to reinforce to our audience as well that blackdoctor.org, we have a clinical trials resource center. It's updated daily, and we have information on the latest clinical trials that particularly affect Black folks, as well as listings for clinical trials that you can participate in or ask your doctor about. So please don't hesitate to visit our clinical trials resource center on our website. And I also want to remind the folks that are listening in that if you have any questions for me and Dr. Morgan, feel free to drop them in the chat. So, Dr. Morgan, I definitely want to ask, what sparked your interest in research in the first place?
Not a glamorous story. So I will tell you, I started research at the NIH. I was an internal medicine resident at George Washington University, just graduating from med school, had all these student loans. I think they paid me $20,000 a year. I was living in DC. Wow. And I lived right in Foggy Bottom, just, 2 or 3 blocks from the hospital, right down the street from the White House, right in the middle of the mall. And, there was a time actually when that was not necessarily the high rent district, but we had access to everything. But DC has always been expensive. So, but my salary was $20,000. And the NIH was advertising for moonlighting jobs. So moonlighting means when doctors who still aren't fully certified, we're in training. There are different jobs that you can have. We call that moonlighting. And sometimes you can be fully trained and you're just kind of working extra shifts somewhere. That's called moonlighting. So they were looking for moonlighters. I needed the money. I responded to the ad. They hired me. And I didn't even know what my job was, but my job was to go over to the NIH Division of Infectious Diseases, which was very prevalent during COVID, and to spend the night and monitor all of their patients who were there in clinical trials and had to stay in-house overnight because the staff would leave during the day and they needed a physician there all night. And my job was to, basically keep them alive, but also record any side effects they're having, making certain I'm treating things. If they're, if they start to have chest pain, if they start to bleed, somebody's got to be there to treat them and manage it. I'm not there just to record the information and go to bed. Somebody's got to take care of these people. So I was there all night to take care of them. And that started to be my job. That's actually how I got introduced to research. I just wasn't paid enough. And I needed a side job. Then when I became a senior in the program, I was a third-year resident, and I was doing an ER rotation at George Washington University again in Washington, D.C. Well, during my rotation, they were a study site for a clinical trial, enrolling people in a clinical trial when they had new MIs. Those are myocardial infarctions, or our Latin word for heart attacks. So enrolling patients with heart attacks into these trials. And so all of us were trained on it as I rotated through, and we all had our caps on. And as soon as we saw patients with certain enzymes and things, we were enrolling them into these trials. And so that was my second exposure. Again, I'm not seeking any of these opportunities out. I'm just just going through my life. And as research comes up, I'm stepping into it because that's kind of where I am in my life. Cardiology fellowship, I actually volunteered at that point to do some research with some of the research team on pacemakers. And so there I was again, kind of doing research. But again, believe it or not, even as a cardiology fellow, it never occurred to me that this was going to be a major part of my life, or even any part of my life. It was something that I was doing while I was in training. I thought it was interesting. I was really just going to see patients. I really wasn't going to do research. And it still wasn't clear to me that you could integrate both. I didn't really know people who integrated both, certainly outside of an academic center. I had never seen people doing that. So I wasn't going to work in an academic center. I was going to be out in the community seeing patients. So once I left my training, I was leaving research behind, right? Because research is at the academic center. So, my journey has been one of evolving, of growing, of not being afraid to step forward, not being afraid to be first, not being afraid to be on the leading edge, not being afraid to do something new, having to be comfortable being uncomfortable. So being in a gray area where there really isn't precedence, where people aren't going before you. So, all of that is not something that is for everybody, I would say. There's certainly a lot of hard knocks, a lot of pitfalls, step on a lot of grenades. Especially when there's really nobody mentoring you and nobody going before you. But that's how research, it started to just become a part of my DNA and something that I was interested in, but I didn't know anybody like me doing it. So I just started to seek out my own opportunities. And I ended up at Solvay Pharmaceuticals. Again, almost as a fluke. They were in Marietta, Georgia. They were headquartered in Belgium, but they had their U.S. presence in Marietta, Georgia, and I live in Georgia. And they were looking for a cardiologist to lead all of their safety programs in the United States. It was previously being led out of Europe. They wanted the United States to do its own safety. I applied for the job. I didn't even know what a safety officer was. They said they needed a cardiologist. I figured it can't be that hard, right? I can do that. And I applied. They didn't call me for 11 months. I didn't call them either, if you can believe that. They didn't call me. I didn't call them. Nobody called anybody. I just went on with my life. And then one day, 11 months later, they called me. I was like, oh, yeah, remember I applied to you guys last year. They're like, yeah, we've been on a hiring freeze, but we really would like to hire you. So if you can believe that, in research, I literally only applied to one job in my life, and they didn't call me for a year, and I didn't call them either. So I went and came into Solvay as a safety officer and learned the role. And I'll tell you now what a safety officer is. You work on phase one patients are healthy volunteers. This is before we actually bring people in who have the disease. These are healthy people. And what we're trying to do is measure either the pharmacodynamics, so sort of the body's reaction to the drugs, but also measuring any side effects or adverse events that even healthy people without the disease may have before we even decide if we want to progress it to phase 2 into this sicker population. My job as a safety officer was to manage, it's called a safety stage. Phase 1 was to manage all of these healthy people who are coming from all walks of life to be a part of this program. They're paid, and my job was to take care of all of those patients, and they often stayed overnight. I did all their visits. So it was really being a doctor to patients creating a trial. I'm telling you that because I didn't know what it was when I applied for it, and I didn't know what it was when I was hired for it.
No, and now look at you, just amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
So what are some usual questions that you might have received from patients who are interested in clinical trials or were nervous about clinical trials? What are some questions you received?
Yeah, is this safe for me? Can I trust it? What happens? Can I afford it? Does it cost me anything? Am I being paid? Here's some of the little secrets about clinical trials. If you are uninsured or underinsured, generally, if you are enrolled in a clinical trial, all of your health costs, your medications are covered by the drug company because by and large, they want you in that trial and they need to keep their data clean. So they're going to support what you need. So if you are uninsured or underinsured, here's a way to get access to the health community. Because not only that, you are assigned a doctor who is overseeing your care. That's a local doctor. Then there's a state or regional doctor who's overseeing that local doctor. Then there's a national doctor who may be overseeing the regional doctor who's overseeing the local doctor. Then there may be a global PI who's overseeing the whole thing. You've got all of these doctors watching you, and you generally have a nurse or some other research specialist with whom you have a direct communication, either their phone number, their email, a text message, and you can reach them 24 hours a day as long as you are participating in that trial. Where else do you get healthcare like that? Like, I don't even get healthcare like that. I can't even reach anybody 24 hours a day. So clinical trials actually give you better healthcare. People often say, oh, that I have to come in every 2 months or every 6 weeks. That's too much. Guess what? That's more touch points with a health system. That is keeping you healthier. And here's something else that we do. We have something called optimization. So I'll give you an example. If there are inclusion criteria for a trial. So let's say one of the inclusion criteria is if you have diabetes, your value has to be at a certain level and yours is too high. Instead of excluding you, what most study sites and hospitals will do is bring you in for 2 or 3 times and aggressively work to get your diabetes down to the level where it will qualify. That's great health care for you. Exactly. And then you qualify for the trial. So you're already getting great health care just in people trying to work to qualify you for the trial. So those are kind of some of the little secrets that people don't know of how clinical trials work and how they might actually be beneficial to you. So all those extra visits that you don't want to do to see the doctor, sometimes there are extra visits, sometimes there aren't, but that's the pushback sometimes I get. Those extra visits are helping you stay healthy. This is preventive care. This is your access to a healthcare system that you didn't have before. And now you get to just keep coming, and swarms of people are around you wanting to make certain that you're healthy and you're good. Where else do you get healthcare like that?
That amazing behind the curtain care that you were talking about.
That's right.
Yes. So I know that we're coming up on time, but I want to ask, is there anything else that you feel like our audience, filled with plenty of Black Americans, what do you think they should know about taking care of their heart health and clinical trials? What are some last notes that you think they should?
The last notes I'd like to talk with you about are pregnancy complications, because Black women have the highest rate of maternal mortality. And you're probably wondering, why is a cardiologist, why is a clinical trialist talking about pregnancy? I'm going to connect the dots for you, just like I did for flu and for your dental visits to heart disease. If you are pregnant and you are diagnosed with high blood pressure, they may call it hypertension, or preeclampsia, or gestational diabetes, or eclampsia, or even an older term, toxemia, if you've ever heard any of these terms, generally what we do is we have a high-risk obstetrician join the team and carefully monitor you until we can deliver your baby safely. And once the baby is delivered, generally all of your symptoms return to normal, and we sort of pat ourselves on the back and we've saved another patient. But we now know that patients who have had those complications of pregnancy have a 2 to 3-fold increased risk of heart disease later. Why is that? This is why it's important to have diversity of perspectives, to not live in a myopic world. So here's the obstetrician looking at that patient, managing this high-risk OB patient. Here's how the obstetrician describes this patient. I have a 36-year-old female who is pregnant with complications of preeclampsia. Let's call in a cardiologist, a different perspective, a different lens. A cardiologist looks at the same patient and says, I have a 36-year-old female patient in a volume overload state who has just failed her stress test. You see how that drives a different level of care? Pregnancy to a cardiologist means you have too much volume. If you develop any of those complications, that means that your body wasn't able to manage that volume. That's a failed stress test. Anybody who has a failed stress test is referred to a cardiologist. These pregnant women, after that baby is born, should also have a lifelong relationship with a cardiologist for lifelong preventive care. That not only does that handoff not happen, the cardiologist often is not even included in part of the pregnancy management team. That I have worked stridently to change, to create cardiac OB units. Black women have the highest rate of preeclampsia, more than 7%. We have the highest rate of maternal deaths. And here's something else that I want to leave you with. Black women who are not born in this country do not have high rates of preeclampsia. It's only Black women born in the United States of America. There's something about being on this soil, having to live here and navigate. Remember, I started the conversation with weathering.
Yes.
That our sisters can come from other countries and live here, but not have the complications that we have being born here.
Is there any research that's happening on this? Like, why is this? Like, why is this particularly affecting Black women? Like, are there any trials that are looking into this at all?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about it. Certainly I keep the conversation going. But I think the thought is it's the social structure, the societal structure here in the United States of a race conscious and gender biased society that does not advantage us for either one of those things, and the constancy of having to live and navigate and operate under that, and the wearing down of our bodies on the inside. That people who migrate to this country, recent immigrants, don't experience or are not as aware of it. A lot of times they stay more so in their communities, first generation, before going out into other communities. So it's very, very specific to Black women born in the United States. Not even Caribbean women. Caribbean women do not have the same rate. It is in the United States.
So interesting. This has all been such great information. Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan.
You're welcome.
Amazing. How can our audience find you?
Yes, listen, please follow me. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Jay Morgan, DrJayne, Morgan, Dr. Jane Morgan. And I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me, Dr. Jane Morgan. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Threads. I'm on X. I'm on TikTok. I do probably a lot more on Instagram than all of those other platforms, but I do post on all of those platforms, including today.
Yes, yes, amazing. Well, thank you again for coming on the show, and you have an
Thank you.
amazing day.
Thank you, Taylor. You too. Bye, everybody.
Bye.